Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 12th, 2023, and I'm sure you've heard the news by now that the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, has now ordered an impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden. Now, this has to do with a lot of inside politics on the GOP side, a lot of pressure from some of the more extreme members of the right wing, pushing Kevin McCarthy, threatening a government shutdown to put the GOP in a difficult position where they have to launch this impeachment inquiry, at least in the eyes of those members. Kevin McCarthy, of course, following suit, as he did in numerous concessions through his House Speaker vote, which took 15 times for him to become House Speaker, in an extremely unprecedented way. We are seeing equally that in terms of Kevin McCarthy's concessions, and now a concession in terms of an actual inquiry into President Joe Biden. Now, first things first, this impeachment inquiry did not come through a traditional House vote. What I mean by that is, if you take a look at the history of impeachments, you will find that in both situations where President Bill Clinton and President Trump, Donald Trump's first impeachment, were impeached, both of them were opened with a vote of the full House, meaning they allowed people to get on the stage, get down on the floor, not stage, and vote as to how they wanted to see the impeachment inquiry go. If it was going to pass, if it was going to fail, that was to be determined by the representatives that were elected by members, the United States, citizens, obviously, our Congress, right? But what President Biden is now facing is, again, this unprecedented surrounding his impeachment inquiry. It isn't something that was decided by a full House vote, but rather decided by Kevin McCarthy himself. He subverted the entire process, went around the open House vote, and the reason for doing so was because he knew that if it got to the House floor, that the vote would fail. And the reason for that is a lot more political than you think. It isn't just that some of these members like President Biden, because quite frankly, they don't. It's more so about politicking, about how this is going to be perceived by the GOP. And based on John Fetterman's words, he dared Republicans to try to impeach Joe Biden, saying, quote, "You're going to lose," saying ultimately that this would end up hurting the Republican Party rather than helping it, which is a bit different than the narrative that went on President Trump's impeachment back in 2021. Now, looking at where we are with this impeachment, President Biden does not necessarily have much to worry about. For the past 9 months, the Republican Party has been gathering evidence to see if there's any correlation between President Biden's son's foreign dealings and President Biden and his wealth and his assets, and trying to see if there was any type of corruption or quid pro quo or benefit that President Biden made through these financial dealings, both himself and his son. Now, ultimately, the Republican Party, as if you've been looking at what they've been trying to uncover, they have found nothing to date. They have yet to been able to find information surrounding anything that would be relative for an impeachment inquiry, and that's why they're saying they're launching this inquiry in the first place. Again, in an unprecedented mood, you typically wait until you receive the evidence, as there was in 98, in 2019, in 2021, but this time, they're saying the inquiry is to find the evidence. Again, this is an approach that is quite unorthodox, something that we haven't seen before in American politics, and it isn't just Democrats that are speaking out against this impeachment inquiry, it's also Republicans. For instance, many members of the Senate GOP leadership and also just delegation here say the House lacks evidence for impeachment. For one, we find here that we have John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, works with Ted Cruz here, saying it's unlikely to be successful in the Senate, being a very realistic person when it comes down to this, saying it's about priorities, it's about doing what you actually can follow through on. Now, they don't think that, this isn't necessarily just surrounding whether or not President Biden would be convicted by the Senate, but also on the wave that they're looking at it from the perspective of, is there enough evidence here? And it isn't just John Cornyn who's speaking in here too. You also have Shelley Moore Capito, who is a Republican senator from West Virginia, might I add, the most Republican state in the country, recently surpassed Wyoming for its conservative nature, being asked if there's enough evidence to impeach President Biden, and she said that she believes there is not. She does not believe there is enough evidence to impeach Joe Biden. Even Senator Marco Rubio from the state of Florida saying that impeaching a sitting president should generally be avoided for the interest of the country. It can't become routine. Now, obviously, he was against the impeachments in 2019 and 2021, but he also says it about this, whereas many other Republicans, including Kevin McCarthy, have flip-flopped on this issue in an effort to appease to the extreme members of the Republican Party. But Kevin McCarthy, like I said, went through an unorthodox situation or avenue for a reason. He knew that if it was to make it to an open full House vote, that it would fail. And it would fail because, again, they do not have the evidence, as many members of the Senate GOP delegation have indicated, as many members of the Republican House have said. And the reason, again, there's a lot of political maneuvering. It's much more than just internal GOP politics. It's also external GOP politics. What you have on your screen right now are the crossover districts from 2000 to 2022. We're only really worried about 2022, though these numbers are interesting to look at on their own. And we find that in 2022, there are 5 Democrats in seats Donald Trump won in 2020. What I mean by that is, on the presidential map, if you were to draw the same congressional boundaries in 2020, Donald Trump would win 5 districts currently held by Democrats in the newly elected House. But on the Republican side, there are 18 Republicans in districts that Joe Biden won in the last election. Meaning, there's a lot more to lose for Republicans than Democrats when it comes down to supporting President Biden's impeachment. And we often forget, because this is how it was in 2020, it seems to have become the norm, even though in reality, it simply is not. Republicans have just a 4-seat advantage in the House of Representatives. It is far from substantial, it is far from well enough, and it is far from being realistic to see Joe Biden actually impeached, unless there is substantial enough evidence, which, newsflash, according to the Senate GOP themselves, there simply is not. This impeachment inquiry, again, follows 9 months of painstaking research, painstaking investigation, efforts to take down the president of the United States. And the fact that they have come up with nothing, number one, is very telling. But number two, very telling about how this speaks to a level of desperation. A level of desperation around impeaching President Biden because they're upset that President Trump was also impeached. And if you are worried on the Democratic side about enthusiasm, this impeachment inquiry will likely rile up the crowd in the way that Donald Trump's indictments have for his GOP election. The only difference here is that Republicans are the only ones who believe Donald Trump is innocent, versus the majority of America does in fact believe that impeachment is the wrong way to go. About 56% of registered voters believe that the GOP impeachment inquiry into President Biden, or would be, because this is hypothetical, this is taken at the end of August, would be a partisan political stunt, including 20% of President Trump supporters. Then there's that question: who believes it will be a serious effort to investigate important problems? 73% of Trump voters versus just 7% of Joe Biden voters that are giving Republicans the benefit of the doubt. And we see here that the question was, is this more about finding the truth or about damaging Biden politically? About 6 points more Americans, 6% more Americans believe that it's about damaging Biden politically, which shows the problem with this impeachment inquiry, that it's not being viewed in the same way as Donald Trump's January 6th impeachment, or in the same way that Bill Clinton's or Donald Trump's first impeachment was. The American public was a bit more lopsided in favor of Democrats in the 2019 impeachment, and Republicans, or at least actually Democrats by the end of it, but for an initial period of time, there was a consensus amongst the American public that this president should be impeached, that this president has conducted wrongdoing. This time around, that simply is not the case. And I have to remind you, Democrats are constantly looking, where can we pick up seats? Where can we gain? Where can we win? And they look at the House map and say, wait a second, there are a number of seats that we could win as the Democratic Party, that they could win against the GOP simply by having President Biden back on the ballot in 2024. There's these districts here, 18 of them. And while many of them might have survived in 2020 or survived in 2022, I can guarantee you to a near certainty that 2024 will be more Democratic than 2022 and potentially on par, if not more, than the 2020 election. That should terrify Republicans, especially if they decide to go through with this. Now, John Fetterman is right. This is only going to hurt them even more. But I don't know if they necessarily care. The current state of the race in 2024 has practically been Donald Trump's winning, coalition on the GOP side. There hasn't been a point in time in the past 6 months that has shown any real indication that the GOP primary is close. I mean, maybe it was closer back in February and March. Don't get me wrong. But it was still a 15-point advantage. It was still a substantial enough lead that even I looked at and said, well, President Biden has this in the bag, but so does President Trump when it comes down to the nomination. I mean, both of them are likely going to be the nominees. But even today, I am much more reaffirmed that President Trump is on track to be that nominee. I mean, Ron DeSantis at 13, Vivek Ramaswamy at 7, Nikki Haley at 6, everybody else 5 and below. No one has a chance except for the former president. And that is the most fascinating part about this entire election, is that we are on track in more ways than one for a rematch. But Kevin McCarthy, I just simply do not think is doing a good strategy. Looking at the Republican Party, they need to have this juxtaposition, sure, right? That President Biden also was impeached in some ways, but there isn't much else that the Republican Party has to stand on besides vibes, besides the fact that they want Joe Biden to be impeached. And again, think about who is under threat from the right. It's Kevin McCarthy, who, surprisingly enough, is a more centrist member of the House GOP delegation. But think about the right-wing members, specifically the Freedom Caucus, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, and the GOP on the GOP congressional side, and think about who they are representing. They're representing that 30% of voters here that believe that President Biden should still be impeached, even if there is no evidence found. 1 in 3 Americans believe this to be true, including 63% of Trump voters and 4% of Biden voters. 49% Republicans, 19% Democrats. And the reason why, maybe in some cases there could be some level of strategy being thrown into this, but generally speaking, this goes to show that there are a considerable portion, the majority of Trump voters, according to this poll, believe that President Biden should still be impeached. Those are the people who are being represented by candidates like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Lauren Boebert, like the extremist members of the Freedom Caucus. So when they go to Kevin McCarthy, they have their own electoral imperative to back this impeachment inquiry and to threaten it, because quite frankly, the majority of Donald Trump's voters from the last election agree with that narrative. The majority of them want President Biden to be impeached. And that is the fundamental problem here, because it's not about appealing to independent voters. It's all about, to Kevin McCarthy, appeasing the voters that he needs the most, appeasing the representatives that he will need in future House Speaker votes. And with that, you alienate the general election. You alienate the 61% of Americans that disagree with this decision. You alienate the 51% of Americans that believe, or 56% that believe, this is a partisan political stunt. For all of the gains you make on the GOP side, similar to Donald Trump's, you regress on the general. You regress, and you put yourself in a point where it may not be as winnable as you otherwise might think. And Kevin McCarthy knows all about that from the 2022 midterms, when Republicans barely won back control of the House of Representatives. But mark my words, in a very similar way that Republicans were ousted for voting to impeach President Biden in the primaries, wait until the general. Because considering how many Republicans are still in Biden districts, if they toe the party line, if President Biden is actually impeached, the enthusiasm problem becomes significantly less substantial for Democrats, because now they can do the same strategy that Donald Trump is doing with the indictments. And also, Democrats are in a position where they're going to win a number of seats. They're going to oust many prominent members of the GOP if they vote to impeach President Biden, because that's not where we are right now. There are enough House Republicans that are against it, numerous Senate Republicans that will likely call in favors in states where they live, where they might have competitive races. For example, I could very much imagine, Senator Ted Cruz calling a member from a competitive seat in the state of Texas, or maybe calling elsewhere, right? Trying to sway these Republicans to say, hey, even if it gets this far, nothing's going to happen. There's no point. There's no point of making us an enemy, wasting taxpayer dollars, especially right before an election year. I mean, in 2019, even then, the optics weren't the best for the Democratic Party, and they knew that. But at least in 2021, there was a much more general consensus amongst the American public before this time around, right? I don't think the American public knew what obstruction of Congress was, but what the GOP is trying to do here, simply, I don't think sticks. Very clearly, the American public does not agree with the decision. You also find that this is a pressure move. This isn't from any actual evidence that has been found, substantiated, whatever it might be. They do not have anything. And yet, for some reason, they think, or are acting as if, they have everything. We will see what happens by the time we get to the end of this impeachment inquiry, impeachment proceeding. Should it get that far, we will see what happens. President Biden will likely be bumped up as a result. And I know it might be interesting to think about, but at the same time, it is starting to become this routine and tried and tested situation with whichever party is in control of the House, somebody is going to get impeached. I mean, that is what the American public is going to start to view it. They're going to start to view this GOP inquiry, especially if they cannot find evidence, as a sham, and it's only going to help President Biden. At least with President Trump in 2021, it was following an insurrection. It was after the election year. 2019, I don't really think had much of an impact on the general election in 2020, but I do think this time around, without substantial proof, without heavy evidence, and considering how rushed and pressure focused this seems to be, it will not go as eloquently as Republicans would have hoped. And it's very clear that the Senate GOP immediately recognizes this simply is not happening. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.